One way to do that would be to measure the levels of cortisol in their blood. Those are examples of physiological measures. Nice thing about physiological measures is they often tend to be pretty accurate, they tend to be pretty reliable, they're typically well defined. They're not, in many cases, they're not based on subjective interpretation. I mean, if your heart rate is 96, your heart rate is 96. As in beats per minute. So they have those kinds of things going for them. But on the downside, many of them require, not all of them, but some might require sophisticated equipment like MRI. So Ty, if you wanted to do a study using MRI images, how likely is it you'd be able to do that here at OPSU?
I couldn't.
Could. How likely is it you could do that anywhere within a 100-mile radius?
How far is WT?
Well, the more likely candidate would be Amarillo.
Mm-hmm.
And there, you could, if you could work out an agreement with the people that had the MRI stuff. But it may be unavailable, it may be expensive. And one of the things you got to be careful about is if you're using a physiological measure to infer a construct, you need to be careful and ensure that what you're measuring is actually an indication of the construct. For example, anxiety. I could measure anxiety using self-reports or some type of anxiety test. But I might also measure anxiety by heart rate. The idea being the more anxious a person is, the higher their heart rate. Or the more anxious they are, the higher their galvanic skin response. Anybody know what the galvanic skin response is?
Sweat.
Sweat, perspiration. Measure of the electrical conductivity of the skin. I mean, think about, here's a good example of where potential problems could arise. The so-called lie detector test. Not somnography, that's sleep. But a polygraph test is what they refer to as a lie detector test. Now, we all know that lie detector tests are valid and reliable, don't we? No, we don't know that. And in fact, there are a number of problems with them. I certainly wouldn't want an important decision being made about me based upon a polygraph test. So they're not free of potential problems either. And it's a matter of trying to be careful to select the appropriate measure or measures. And in fact, in some cases, if you're assessing anxiety, you might want to use multiple measures. You might want a self-report measure, you might want a physiological index, you might also want a behavioral measure, which is the third category. Measure some observable behavior that would reflect anxiety. What does an anxious person do?
They fidget and they're.
Okay, they may fidget. They may do other things that indicate that they're anxious, maybe pace the floor or maybe even shake, quiver. It's like Miranda right before one of my tests. She thinks she's having a seizure, but in reality, she's not. the behavioral measures, can be very helpful. But also, sometimes we use behavioral measures as an index of an underlying construct. An example your book uses is mental alertness. Well, that's all well and good to try to measure mental alertness, but what do you mean by mental alertness? And what index of behavior are you going to use to measure it? One might be reaction time. How long it takes a person to react to the presentation of the stimulus. I present an auditory signal and you press a button as quickly as you can when you hear that signal. The faster you press it, the more mentally alert you are. Would that be stand to reason? Maybe. But there are trade-offs any way you go. And as your book points out, multiple measures may be a good thing to take into consideration. You don't have to. The main thing is that you can justify whatever measurement it is that you've chosen to use and why it is appropriate for that situation. Let's talk about a couple of other things related to measurement. And I'm just going to summarize these pretty quickly. Let's suppose that I give a test in this class. Let's say it's your first test. And everybody, let's put it this way. On that first test, I have out of, what, 17 people I think are in here. Let's say 15 of the 17 make 95 or better. And the other two are between 90 and 95. Well, first thing you're thinking, how likely is that? But if that were to occur, what might that suggest to you about that test?
It was pretty easy.
Yeah, it's pretty easy. And there we're encountering what your book refers to as a ceiling effect. All the scores are up there around the highest score they can be. Maybe the test is too easy. But let's look at the opposite situation. What if I give that test and 15 out of 17 score between 40 and 50, and the other two people score below 40, and this is a 100-point test? The test is probably too tough. And that's what your book refers to as a floor effect. If I'm measuring intelligence in adults, would I want to use the Wechsler intelligence scale for children? No. So I'd probably hit, what, a floor or ceiling effect there? Ceiling. I'd probably get very high scores, much higher than they actually are. Of course, it depends on what adults I'm measuring. Right, Ty? Some adults, I probably want to give them the Wechsler scale for preschool kids. And they still might not do well. Okay, so be familiar with the notion of floor and ceiling effects. Then the last thing is to talk about experimenter bias and participant reactivity. What's experimenter bias?
The person who's doing the experiment they influence the results.
They influence the results in some fashion, possibly, they know what the predicted outcome of the study is. And they've got a vested interest, and they might like to see a particular outcome occur. So either intentionally or maybe unintentionally, they do things that influence the behavior of the participants. Maybe they give clues or hints about something by the way they talk, or by their body posture or their facial expressions, by the way they respond to answers that are given, by maybe not reporting the behavior accurately because they don't want it to undermine their hypothesis. Yeah, well, I've said you need to leave your biases behind, but that's sometimes easier said than done. And sometimes it's not intentional. Sometimes it just kind of creeps in. But a couple of things that you can do to reduce that, one would be to standardize your study as much as you possibly can. Every participant receives exactly the same instructions. Every participant is treated exactly the same way, or as close to exactly the same way as possible. Or run a blind experiment, a single blind or a double blind. Single blind, the participants don't know which treatment they're receiving. Double blind, the participants don't know, neither do the people administering the treatment. In a triple blind study, nobody knows what's going on. In a quadruple blind study, I can't even figure out what's going on. And in a quintuple blind study, even God can't figure it out. So you're in trouble if you run a triple, quadruple, or quintuple study. Do you think those things actually exist? No, but I have to say that in the past in this class, when I'm grading their manuscripts, it's pretty damn close to quadruple or quintuple blind. That's not good if I can't figure out what the hell you did. Tells me you didn't know what the hell you did. Okay, single blind though and double blind are legitimate types of studies. Okay, what are demand characteristics and what do they mean by participant reactivity? In fact, we're about out of time. I'll leave that to you to read. Know what those refer to, and then it talks about some things on page 100 that can influence demand characteristics and participant reactivity. I kind of rushed it, but I wanted to get to the end of this chapter today.